John Penny, what are the implications for the workplace? We've heard some evidence that passive smoking causes a real environmental problem in the workplace. And what restrictions specifically are we likely to see? And I have a feeling we're going to get into it over those restrictions.
Well, I think that the first thing that's important to note is that we're not talking about bashing smokers. We're talking about a health and safety issue. For over 20 years, we recognize that smoke contains a lot of dangerous substances, and as Dr. Glantz pointed out, many of them are already regulated by themselves. Benzene, for example, is heavily regulated by OSHA. When people recognize that it is a health and safety issue, not an anti-smoker effort, not some sinister plot, but a simple effort to protect people where they work from exposure to dangerous chemicals, they and their smoking co-workers generally recognize this is something that's important to do. And we have seen very few problems where people understand what this is about. And I think it's unfortunate that Mr. Brenton and the Tobacco Institute tend to want to make people believe there's some sinister plot against smokers. That's not the case.
What we're talking about here is banning smoking in the workplace or restricting it to particular areas?
We're really talking about two options, I think. Given what we know, given the science that we have, given the medical evidence we have, we're really only talking about two acceptable options. One, smoking only in areas which are separately ventilated to the outside, or complete elimination of smoking in facilities and in vehicles as well. Most of the companies with which we work are moving in that direction. We just finished a survey of the Fortune 50. 92% of the Fortune 50 have some form of smoking restriction. About 14% of them have a total ban, but 42% of them are thinking seriously about moving to higher levels of restriction. And I think that the trend is to move from what the Tobacco Institute wants people to do, which is that if I smoke and you don't, we'll work it out, which is not a good health and safety policy, to a policy which says simply it's dangerous, we've got to do something, and the easiest and the best thing to do is to eliminate it altogether.
Dave Brenton, what do you think of that trend and those potential restrictions?
Well, I think that the issue that troubles me the most is that we hear these kinds of hysterical appeals to our national hypochondria when in fact we've got some real serious indoor air quality problems that need to be addressed. Our federal government knows through its investigations through the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health that we've got a serious problem with indoor air. And 50% of the buildings that they've investigated, they've discovered non-functioning or inadequate ventilation.
Well, Dave, but let's get back on the point here, though. I mean, I actually didn't find this to be a hysterical appeal. Dave, what is it you want to do in the workplace that you think these gentlemen hysterically are trying to prevent you from doing?
I think that they are attempting to manipulate my behavior. They are attempting to coerce my employers to manipulate my behavior. And I can tell you with little fear of contradiction that organizations like John's have been instrumental in persuading companies, the nearly 10% now of private employers, that will not hire a smoker to take that prejudicial attitude. And we're not talking about not smoking at work. We're talking about companies that will not employ a smoker.
But that issue relates more to insurance risks associated with that employee as much as it does
risks. But I'm telling you, John, this is a progressive process. First, they push you into the designated areas. We've watched this pattern repeat itself over and over again. They push people into the designated areas, then out of doors, then into the parking lot, then out of the parking lot, and then out of the workplace completely. This is part of a process that needs to be addressed, and the bottom line is that it's founded on faulty evidence. Only 5 out of the 25 studies that deal with the subject of secondhand smoke and its relationship in homes with spousal non-smokers support any kind of statistically significant link.
Well, then why, Dave, why, let me just ask you, why would these people be so interested in getting rid of passive smoke if it's not for a health reason? Is it just because they don't like you?
They don't like smoking. They have, why do people burn books, John? I mean, it's because they know they're right. They know that they know how to live my life better than I do. And they know that by elevating public hysteria over secondhand smoke, that they can co-opt otherwise unknowing non-smokers into participating in this process.
All right, John Penny, is this a freedom of speech, First Amendment kind of issue, as Dave says?
The only hysteria that I encounter is people like this gentleman who are paid to say what they're saying by the Tobacco Industry.
I'm not paid $1, sir. That's a lie.
I think that the question of hysteria is a false issue. I don't see hysteria.
Do you find in the workplace the kinds of conflicts that Dave is...
We find very few conflicts. As I said, when reasonable people understand that they, as smokers, are creating a risk for their coworkers, they're willing to modify their behavior, even to the point of not smoking at work.
Do you think it's a conflict in the office space, Dave Brenton?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What evidence?
And I think that in many cases those conflicts have been recognized and dealt with years ago. Let's recognize something. And it's important to understand this. Smokers have been in the minority in this country forever. Forever. This is not a new phenomenon. There has never been a numerical majority of smokers in this country, and the fact of the matter is that non-smokers and smokers have been getting along fine for years. We have been able to work out these issues. This whole issue is based on the unfounded assertion that being around a smoker is killing you, and that simply is not true.
Well, what would your response be, Dave, if I asked you not to smoke?
Depends on where we are, John.
Well,
generally speaking, I would happily comply with your wishes because I'm a nice guy and I think you are too.
Well, could I
sure, Stan,
interject something here? You know, if someone were to come up and assert that they had a right to put a 50-gallon drum of benzene on their desk and take the lid off and let the fumes permeate the building, or acrolein or formaldehyde or one of the other 4,000 or so compounds that's in the cigarette smoke, you'd think they were nuts, and you'd probably consider their employer negligent for letting them do it. And yet, when somebody burns a cigarette, that's exactly what they're doing. I sit on a body called the California State Scientific Review Panel on Toxic Air Contaminants, and we're part of the regulatory process with the Air Resources Board here for controlling outdoor air. And almost every single one of the compounds that's been processed through the state in California and listed and regulated as an air toxic is in secondhand smoke.
But Stanton,
cadmium is, and in fact, the levels of exposure are generally higher indoors than outdoors, and it's because of cigarette smoke.
But
we're forcing industry to spend millions of dollars to get rid of this stuff in the outdoor air, when most of it's in fact appearing in the indoor air because of cigarettes.
Are smokers an easier political target, though, for cleaning up indoor air? And architects and perhaps insulation manufacturers and others might also be targeted to eliminate some of these chemicals?
Well, in fact, there are the formaldehyde, for example. The two main places that comes from is secondhand smoke and certain kinds of insulation. And in California, they've changed the rules, and they're not allowed to use those compounds which give rise to a lot of formaldehyde from the insulation. I don't think it's an issue of a political target. Every survey that's been done has shown that if done the way Mr. Pinney is suggesting, that is to explain why you're doing it to smokers, that you're not after them, that you just want to get rid of the pollution, that smokers support restrictions on smoking. Most adult smokers have tried to quit. In any given year, a third of them attempt to quit. And a lot of people find that the creation of a smoke-free workplace is actually something that they want. The surveys that have been done after smoke-free workplaces have been put into force, if it's been done correctly, show overwhelming support not just among the non-smokers, but among the smokers.
Stan, I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you, Stanton, John, and Dave Brenton. Complicated issue, to be sure. Nightwatch will be just right back in a moment. You may not know very much about Somalia, but it has played a pivotal role in superpower politics in the past, and right now, Somalia is in big trouble. Somalia is a nation of 8 million people in the Horn of Africa, and it is a nation in the midst of a very bloody civil turmoil. Rebels have launched what they call a final offensive against the government of President Mohamed Siad Barre, who has ruled for 21 years. Witnesses say the fighting inside the capital of Mogadishu has left a horror of mass destruction, looting, and decomposing bodies. Most recently, the United States engineered a daring rescue in Somalia. Marine helicopters were diverted from the Desert Shield operation to sweep in and evacuate 260 people, including the U.S. and Soviet ambassadors. Two people join us now to look at developments in Somalia. Peter J. Schrader is a professor of political science at Loyola University of Chicago. He is a specialist on U.S. foreign policy in Africa, especially in the Horn of Africa. And joining us from London is Rakia Omar, the executive director of Africa Watch. She is an attorney and is a native of Somalia. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rakia, I'll begin with you. Most personally, really with the most personal stake in what's going on in Mogadishu and Somalia now. How do you describe what's been happening, and what can you tell us about what's going on now?
Well, it's really almost very difficult to find the right words to describe the horror that's going on, the desperation of the citizens of Mogadishu. I mean, one of the things that is both painful and ironic, you know, as a citizen of Somalia, is to see the extent to which, when the going gets rough, the Western countries that have had such a major role to play in Somalia and in the region are concentrating on one thing and one thing alone, and that's getting their nationals out. That's a responsibility they have and one they must exercise. But the real victims of this war and the ones who have a much more tangible reason to fear Siad Barre and his army are Somali citizens, and their situation and their fate seems to be largely marginalized in the minds of policymakers in Washington and London and other countries, including the Middle Eastern countries that have played a major role. What we are hearing is a city in total chaos, where there is acute shortage of food, of water, firewood. The people who bring these things in obviously come in from the outside, and they are not going to come into a city that is literally being torn apart. Shopkeepers have either been looted, or they're simply too afraid to go and open shops that will be looted in any case. And there are people literally just clawing at the airplanes that are leaving. And I may also add that we've been hearing a lot about aeroplanes landing in Nairobi, in Abu Dhabi, which of course there's been speculation as to whether Siad Barre is on those aeroplanes. But whether he's on or not, what is certainly very clear is that high-ranking ministers who have played a major role in bringing about the desperate situation Somalia faces, they are now getting out.
So government officials are getting out. Siad Barre's whereabouts are unknown at this point. Is that what you're saying?
Well, Siad Barre's whereabouts are unknown, but what I'm also saying is that high-ranking officials that have played a major role in creating this desperate situation are able to get out. But the people who have been the victims of this war and these policies, where are they? Nobody's helping them get out. And that is yet again another irony of the situation, that the people who have paid such a high price are the ones that have nowhere to go when they are the ones who need to get out.
Peter Schrader, this in some ways is an old story, in the sense that Siad Barre is someone who was courted by the United States, someone supported by U.S. policy for a long period of time, with really very little sensitivity to the kinds of domestic problems that his dominance, being a representative of a very small tribe, really, you know, the consequences of that were really not very well foreseen by the State Department.
I mean, I think that's a perfect statement, because the United States got involved in Somalia, not because I think we were interested in Somalia per se, but because of larger strategic considerations during the late 1970s. And particularly after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, as well as the Iranian Revolution, there was a perceived need within the Carter administration to be able to respond to events within the Middle East. So therefore, Somalia became an African solution to a non-African problem. And I think that in terms of the United States' foreign policy, this represents a tendency to look at external threats and then downplay, because of that, the internal shortcomings of a particular regime, in this case, Siad Barre.
Is Somalia, and I'll address this question to both of you, is Somalia a victim of really the Cold War, in the sense that it was carved up because of ideological characterizations? Is Somalia pro-communist? Is Somalia pro-West? Is Ethiopia pro-communist? Is Ethiopia pro-West?
Well,
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Rakia.
Well, I was going to say that there are a couple of responses I have to that. One is that you know, the U.S. Involvement in Somalia is obviously linked as well to the 1977-1978 war between Somalia and Ethiopia, when the USSR switched its allegiance from Somalia to Ethiopia, and of course the U.S. then wanted to counterbalance that in the context of the Cold War competition. But I think it's very important to distinguish between the government of a country, I mean particularly a country like Somalia and Ethiopia, and the people of that country. When you talk about whether Somalia is a victim, I mean, Siad Barre, as the head of Somalia, made certain decisions that obviously were based on his own short-term or long-term political interests. He was not thinking at that time or at any time in the 21 years that he's been in power of what are the interests of his country and
he did pretty well, is what you're saying. Siad Barre did pretty well in this.
Well, he did pretty well for himself, but it's
right.
You know, but it's very important not to sort of talk about Somalia as a victim, because the people of Somalia for the last 21 years have not had a say in how their country is run, in what sort of foreign policy they have. So we, you know, if we're going to look at the choices that Siad Barre made, we must analyze those in the context of the decisions he made to preserve and maintain and strengthen his own power and the basis of his role in the Horn.
All right, a short break, and we'll be back to talk about the future of Somalia in the grip of really extraordinary civil turmoil when Night Watch continues in just a moment.
This is KCCI, TV8 in Des Moines.
About Somalia and the instability that's taken place in Somalia, rebel forces trying to oust the government of Siad Barre, who's been ruling Somalia for the last 21 years. All this taking place in the context at a time when so much attention is focused on what's going on in the Persian Gulf. Why is Somalia getting so little attention right now, Peter Schrader, and what does that mean in terms of policy and what the people of Somalia can expect in the next several months as things perhaps sort themselves out?
Well, I think one of the reasons why, or there's several reasons. First of all, is because I think the American people in general, we tend to have what I call a National Geographic image of Africa. If you ask the typical American, what is Africa to them, it automatically conjures up stereotypical images of lush jungles and wild animals. And I think this stereotypical image is reinforced by two things. The first one would be media programming. And by this I mean that the media in the United States has a tendency to often focus on either the sensationalistic or negative side of African politics. And then this is further reinforced by what I term the safari tradition of American journalism. And all I mean by that is that we have a tendency here in the United States, unlike, I think, our European allies, to send journalists with a generalist attitude toward Africa in short-term situations, rather than
going for the famine, but don't base anyone in Mogadishu.
Exactly, right. I mean, you find correspondents based in Nairobi or Lagos, Nigeria, the major capitals of Africa. So what we get are discontinuous segments of day-to-day living in Africa. We really, in the United States, do not get a complete continuous picture of ongoing political events.
I would point out that the Washington Post and the New York Times have permanent basings in some of these places, but it is not a generalized trend, as you well know. But I would also say that there's not much interest generated, at least apparent to me, by the State Department in what's going on in Somalia right now, regardless of what the television networks are doing.
So I think in terms of the U.S. government, I mean, that's a very good point, because here in the United States, Africa tends to fall at the bottom of interest of the foreign policymaking establishment. If we look at current events, what is hot? East-West relations, traditional concerns with the Atlantic Alliance in Europe. And when we do focus on the regions of the Third World, there's always regions of greater importance. During the 60s, it was Southeast Asia. During the 70s and the 80s, and now the 90s again, it's the Middle East. During the 80s, it was also Central America.
We learned very little about Vietnam, even though we were there, I mean, from a cultural perspective, and I think the same stands perhaps to be true about the Middle East. Raquel, let me let you jump in.
Okay, now I was just going to make the point that even though the Washington Post and the New York Times have correspondents in Nairobi and in Abidjan, they also tend to cover 35 to 40 countries in Africa. The Washington Post has one correspondent in the whole of Africa other than South Africa. Now it's really impossible to expect that correspondent to have the time to do the sort of in-depth analysis that's necessary to give the sort of full picture to policymakers and the media in the United States. But I mean, Neil Henry's done a very good job, so I don't want to make it seem as if that's the problem of the Washington Post. But I think the important thing is also that there is, in many countries in Africa, there is very little historical connection between the United States and that particular country. In the case of Somalia, in the case of Malawi or Zimbabwe, there isn't the connection that there is with Britain. I mean, you have tens of thousands of Somali refugees who have fled this war, who have come to Britain because the part of the country that that was first in turmoil, the north, is a former British protectorate. So there is a natural tendency to come here if they can find grounds for asylum, whereas there just isn't that connection with the United States.
Rakia, let me ask a question then to turn it around. Let's inform at this point. I mean, the reasons I think are fairly clear why Somalia doesn't get as much attention. What is it that Americans should understand about Somalia politically? I mean, you've mentioned, of course, the terrible condition of the people in this current situation. What is it you would state now? I mean, obviously, we only have 3 minutes. I don't want to put you completely on the spot.
Yeah. Well, I do want to make the point, though, that I don't want to get the State Department off the hook. It's not correct to say that the State Department could not have foreseen the consequences of supporting Siad Barre and that they don't know what's going on. The State Department benefits from a general ignorance of its policies in some of these countries because it can then go on supporting a dictator like Siad Barre. What I think is necessary is for a concern by the people of the United States, which then holds the State Department accountable for the policies it follows in countries like Somalia. The media must play a much more involved role. I think the black community in the United States must play the sort of role they have played with regard to South Africa. In other African countries, there's a tendency to sort of follow double standards and condemn the apartheid regime, but not to apply those same standards to brutal dictators in Africa. That must stop. But I just think that the sort of involvement that has made successive administrations accountable for their policies in Central America must be nurtured in the United States, so that
and democracy is nurtured by people being informed on these matters.
Being informed and by people being protesting the sort of policies that lead to a denial of human rights. That is what has to begin in the United States if small countries like Somalia are to feature in the conscience of the people of America.
Peter Schrader, what do you think Americans should know about the U.S.-Somalia relationship as it has gone on with Siad Barre?
Well, I think the main thing that we should focus upon is that Somalis are extremely tired of the interclan conflict within Somalia that has been largely generated by President Siad Barre. And the #1 priority should be in terms of removing Siad Barre from power. However, that can be accomplished through the offices of the United States. I think that one important issue here is the nature of the Cold War. I think a major problem here is that because of the lessening of the Cold War conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, Africa has tended to fall off the map, whereas it was very prominent during the late 1970s and the early 1980s. Right now, because of lessening U.S.-Soviet tensions, Somalia literally has fallen off the map.
Let's hope that in the last second, let's just hope that the New World Order does not mean the invisibility of Africa, and I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining me, Rakia from London and Peter Schrader here in Washington.
Thank you.
Nightwatch will be back in just a moment.
Thank you.
Coming up next week, commentator Carl Rowan's life, livelihood, and pursuit of social justice.
Earlier in the broadcast, we discussed diplomatic aspects of the Gulf crisis. Now we want to look at what it'll be like on the ground. Are our troops ready to fight? And how will the news media report the conflict to the American people? Joining us from the Pentagon now is CBS News Pentagon correspondent David Martin. Welcome, David. You've just returned, really, in the last few days from Saudi Arabia. What about the issue of readiness? What's your assessment of readiness, and what does it mean even to be ready for something like this?
Well, I think the readiness varies from service to service. I think the Marines and the Air Force and the Navy are ready or just about to be ready. There are 3 more aircraft carriers that are just about entering the region, and I think those aircraft carriers will be on station and ready to go by the 15th. The question mark is the Army. Something like 60 to 70% of all of the Army forces that have been committed to Operation Desert Shield are now in place. That means you still have tens of thousands, literally, of Army troops still to go. Question is, do you need every last Army troop there in order to launch an operation? Obviously, only a commander who has command of all of the details of the battle plan can answer that question for you. However, I think it is probably correct to assume that if the U.S. starts a war sometime after the 15th, it's going to start with airstrikes, and those airstrikes would precede any ground operation by some, again, unspecified period of time. So it's conceivable that you could begin airstrikes 1 minute past the expiration of the deadline if you wanted to, and not yet be fully ready to go on the ground, but be counting on the fact that within X number of days you would be ready to go on the ground. Another thing to keep in mind here is that there are a total now of something like 8 divisions over there on the ground. No U.S. commander has ever commanded that many divisions.
Never? That's completely unprecedented?
I'm sorry, I better take that back. No U.S. commander now in uniform has ever commanded that many divisions. There's just no experience for that in uniform anymore. And I think certainly the people I talk to doubt seriously that you can maneuver that many divisions about on the ground. So I think what you're talking about when you come to a ground offensive is a much more limited operation than all of the troops you see there. Perhaps 2 or 3 divisions, probably tank divisions, maneuvering at any one time. So again, you don't need all of the forces there to launch the operation. A lot of these forces, I think, are intended as follow-on forces. Some of them, I'm sure, have other missions. If you look at, for instance, the Marines, they're a very mobile force. They got there early and they got there quick, and they did their job in this first mission of defending Saudi Arabia. But when you look at a Marine battalion on the ground in the desert, they look very, very vulnerable. Most Marine battalions don't have tanks. They have light, literally made of aluminum, amphibious vehicles that they roll around the desert in. Those are not the kind of forces you want to send into the teeth of Iraqi fortifications. So again, you've got something like 100,000 Marines over there. They may simply be used to freeze the Iraqi forces in place so that the Iraqi forces that are facing the Marines could not be taken away and thrown into the breach against, say, the Army divisions.
You know, on some level, I was reading that the Marine job may be done, that they were the defensive force protecting Saudi Arabia at this point and are not going to be part, at least right away, of a penetration across that Kuwaiti border.
I think that's right. Again, obviously, I don't know what the details of the battle plan are, but just looking at the kinds of forces available, it's hard to understand why a commander would send Marines when he could send an Army tank division. I think the role of the Marines will be, as I said, to just feint and freeze the Iraqi defenders in place, and then perhaps as the offensive progresses, to do some of the things that Marines are trained to do, such as go into Kuwait City and help clear that of any stragglers, the house-to-house fighting, which you can't do with heavy armored vehicles, that you have to do on foot, the kind of moving in behind the lines, for instance, trying to take a command center. That's something the Marines could do in helicopters.
What details did you notice in the time you were in Saudi Arabia, and I'm sure you're anticipating many trips back? What details did you notice that indicate various levels of readiness, of preparedness being crossed as this force prepares for a battle instead of sits and waits?
Well, to me, the most striking thing about the troops that I saw was the morale. I found it really quite impressive, if by morale you mean serious and dedicated to the job and the mission that you've been assigned to do. If you mean by morale having a good time, then the morale stinks over there. But if you mean by morale going about your business the best way you know how, I found it very impressive in all of the units that I visited.
What about the mood at the Pentagon? Since what's happened in Geneva this week, do you feel a sense of escalation, of electricity there about what's to come, or what, or not?
Well, I almost sensed this morning a feeling of depression. I think that most of the people in the Pentagon I've talked to, most of the senior commanders over in Saudi Arabia that I talked to, all believed in their heart of hearts that at the 11th hour Saddam Hussein would blink, and he would blink because he just has to know that he is up against an overwhelming military force, and that if he goes to war with this force, he's going to invite the destruction of his army and the destruction of his economy. It simply is in his self-interest to avoid this war. And I think while the Pentagon has been proceeding with the preparations for war, that's its job, to get ready to go and do what the president tells it it has to do. I think people have gone about it with the feeling that this probably is not going to be necessary in the end. And I felt this morning that belief has evaporated here.
This is not a drill. Definitely the mentality at the Pentagon.
This is not a drill. Of course, it's never been a drill because we always had this one mission of defending Saudi Arabia against an Iraqi invasion. But you know, military life is consumed by preparing for contingencies which you know in your heart of hearts are never going to happen. And the mere fact that you're preparing for them, of course, is the best guarantee that they'll never happen, such as preparing to defend Europe against a Soviet invasion. Now, they're preparing for a contingency which, with each passing day, looks more and more like it is going to happen. And you do sense a different mood, but you don't sense a sort of a raw meat mood. You really, it's a somber, almost depressed mood.
And not gun-ho. We'll be back in just a moment with CBS Pentagon correspondent David Martin when Nightwatch returns. Our guest is CBS News correspondent at the Pentagon, David Martin. David, tell us a little bit about the authorization that Secretary of Defense Cheney mentioned this week, that he's going to need a further declaration to make it possible for him to keep some of the people over there that have been there for a little while.
Well, he has, in fact, now requested the president to declare a national emergency which would give the Pentagon the authority to call up to 1 million reservists and keep them on active duty for up to 2 years. Right now, the Pentagon is operating under authority which allows it to call up 200,000 reservists for up to 6 months. It is about to exceed that authority, both in the 200,000, it's going to end up calling more than 200,000 reserves, and in the 6-month time frame. The 6-month clock will start to run out for some of the earliest units that were activated on February 20th, but really to get them out of Saudi Arabia all the way back to the United States and discharged back into private life, you really have to start well before February 20th to do that. So that clock is about to run out. So he has requested, and I'm certain that the president will grant him this authority. And the most immediate impact is that all those reservists that have been either already called or told they're about to be called, and that totals 188,000, they now have to look at the prospect of staying on active duty for up to 2 years, not just 6 months. Then all those people who are in something called the individual ready reserve, these are people who are not weekend warriors. They served on active duty in the military at one point, and now they're just in the reserves and civilian life, but they don't train. It's just an obligation that they have. Now those people, who I'm sure when they left active duty thought that was the end of their military service, they all face the prospect of being called up, although no one, repeat, no one is talking about the need to call up all 1 million reservists that this authority covers.
David, tell me a little about the journalistic rules of engagement as they are still, I understand, being worked out. Pool coverage, access of the media on the battlefield, that sort of thing.
Well, it's, without questioning anybody's motives in this thing, it is a formula for total control by the military of what gets reported about any kind of hostilities. The military has total control over the press in what units it can visit and when, and then it has the right to review any material gathered by the press when it visits those units. So the military has control of the reporting process, both going in and coming out. So it's just bound to give total control of this reporting process to the military.
Having some experience in Israel, theoretically the Israeli military has that same power, but it's often a power that they're happy to relinquish when things start hitting the fan and it gets pretty tense. This is going to be a real logjam for some of the journalists, yes?
Well, I have, you know, as it's worked so far, and of course hostilities haven't started yet, as it's worked so far, the press operation over there insists that no journalist go out in the field on his own, and it's pretty easy for them to enforce that because it's impossible to show up at a unit and say, hi, here we are, can we talk to some of your guys, unless you have an escort with you and it's all pre-coordinated.
Okay, well, we've run out of time. David, thank you very much.
Sure thing.
David Martin, CBS News correspondent at the Pentagon. Nightwatch will return in just a moment. Talk of war and tactics this morning, with colored maps, talk of diplomatic flurries, all weathered debris at the edge of all-out conflict. A border region between peace and war. Tumbleweeds of activity blow by in a stiff wind, hot, angry, and unmindful of the living beings arrayed in military-industrial splendor in this place called no man's land. It is worth noting that the frontline troops on the ground in Saudi Arabia have been ordered in the last week or so to pack up their personal effects and send them all home. These so-called first strike troops now on the move, traveling light, having shed all but the barest evidence that they are individuals. The color, nuance, and highlight of memento and knick-knack, letters from Mom, all gone now, flaked off these soldiers like paint from a wooden post on a forgotten fence in this no man's land. So much talk in this nation of healing the psychological and cultural wounds of Vietnam, the dream and hope of so many to put Vietnam behind us. Dreams of veterans, dreams of widows, dreams of politicians, and dreams of generals. All of them in different ways understanding gradually this week that Vietnam's war feels more behind us, just as a war looms large in front of us now. The arguments and principles and pleas for restraint crowd passionately in this stiff wind at the edge of conflict. One can feel it. The paint flakes off each of them as well, scattered and weathered by the lifeless carpenter of events, destiny. It is a stiff wind now. That's our broadcast for this Friday. For everyone here at Nightwatch, I'm John Hockenberry in Washington.